I want to talk about this connection between defaunation and refaunation. And my first argument was that we are blessed in having such a beautiful planet after a long process of evolutionary development, in which we have an incredibly beautiful and hyper-diverse planet, including animals that we see in this slide. Although our friends in the world of marine sciences tend to think that we live in a blue planet, which is correct because of the coverage of the planet with the oceans, but I think we have to recognize that we have a planet which is also green in terms of vegetation and the terrestrial wildlife that lives on this beautiful green planet. This wonderful legacy that we have of animals on the planet today is perhaps expressed in our current times in the diversity of wildlife that we have in the African continent that maintains the wildlife that includes the megafauna, as you can see in this slide. Beautiful decoration that we still feel so proud and so careful about hoping to maintain on the planet. If we move on to our area of the planet in Latin America, although we don't have such an equivalent megafauna as diversified as in the African continent, we do have our megafauna as well. After the extinctions of the Pleistocene, what we have been left with is this amazing megafauna, some examples of which you see here, including some that are very representative of the wildlife in Brazil, in the Amazon in general. Going from medium-sized animals such as the kinkajous, Protos flavus, to the spectacular tapirs and giant anteater and the spectacle bear, and of course the carnivores such as the jaguar. We are blessed in a region of the planet in the sense that of the incredible mammalian diversity that now accumulates getting close to 6,000 different species. We have a very high density of those animals in the Brazilian, in the Amazon, in the Brazilian region in particular. As you can see here, the intensity of the red colors, of the red pixels in this image, shows that although we do not have the spectacular megafauna that is present in, say, Central Africa or in the African continent in general, we do have a tremendous diversity of species. Really, this is a spectacular region in the sense that no other region of the planet accumulates such a legacy of diversity in the mammalian clade. As you, I'm sure, are aware, we keep on discovering new species, even in this group of animals, which are visible, large body sized, and so on. Here's a representation of a relatively recent paper by Paul Ehrlich and Gerardo Ceballos, showing species that represent the new discoveries that we keep on accumulating. On the bottom right, you see one of the most recent ones, the olinguito from Ecuador, a medium-sized procyonid that has been discovered, amazingly enough, just very recently. Even more amazing, to me anyway, is the discovery of this new species of tapir, just published in 2013. I mean, coming to think about the discovery of this incredibly visible species is an astonishing fact that we can consider as a wonderful representation of what we have on the planet in terms of this legacy of biological diversity as represented by these animals, including ungulates. Unfortunately, this legacy, this decoration of the planet represented by the wildlife, particularly the mammals, is being heavily impacted by what has been called the Anthropocene. As most of you know, perhaps this is relevant for some students, Paul Crutzen, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, in the year 2002, published this very short paper in Nature, addressing or actually complaining about the fact that we no longer should consider that we live in the Holocene, but rather we live in a new epoch or era of the Anthropocene. Given the tremendous footprint that we're imposing on the planet, this is the era of the anthropogenic global change. And as you all know, there is a number of manifestations as to what are the kinds of activities that we as society do that represent biological consequences in the Anthropocene. Here you see in this panel of graphs you don't have to worry about the details of the slide. Just you can see that for a number of variables, including population size, GDP, energy use, fertilizer consumption, water use, and so on and so forth, looking at the trajectory of those activities that we do as society, over the last 2 decades, there has been a tremendous acceleration, as you can see, essentially in all of these graphs, a tremendous acceleration of these activities that we as society do on the planet. And of course, needless to say, those activities have to be represented in terms of the consequences in what we could call the Earth systems that we have on the planet. On this section of the graph, of the slide, you can see that there's a number of manifestations represented in their systems. Obviously, the most common ones, the most paid attention to, are things that have to do with climatic change or atmospheric phenomena, such as accumulation of carbon dioxide on the atmosphere, nitrous oxide, and so on and so forth, ocean acidification, surface temperature, and so on. Very few of these variables here represent what is happening to biological diversity. Although the three graphs at the bottom right, you can see the trajectory of tropical forest loss, or the conversion of land, a thing that is called in this paper domesticated land, and briefly just one graph addressing what is happening to animal and plant life in terms of the number of species that are being degraded, that are being included in the number of species threatened, as you can see in this graph here. But if we review the literature and we go a little bit deeper into what is happening to biodiversity in the Anthropocene, we have a number of metrics, a number of variables that represent this dramatic situation here. Please do not worry about checking all the details of this graph here, of this slide here, but I just wanted to show you that in a recent paper published just over a year ago, we analyzed a number of variables that represent the manifestations of the Anthropocene in terms of biological diversity on the planet. And I wanted to highlight particularly two of those: land surface at the top and the populations of vertebrates and wild animals towards the bottom. In this graph, what you can see in red color is the proportion of those variables that have been affected to some degree, and in the blue color, the proportion which has not been affected or not affected as significantly as has been happening recently. And as you can see, this line here of 50% shows that the vast majority of these drivers, of these indications, of these manifestations of our activities on the planet in the Anthropocene actually are quite significant. And I want to emphasize particularly these two, land surface and terrestrial wild animals, because of the emphasis of our workshop today. Starting with land surface, I think that is an aspect that is relevant for our discussions today. We have what is a very well-known metric to illustrate, to document, to model, and even project what is happening with plant life, with the forested aspects of elements of the planet. And we use the metric of deforestation, a term that everybody in this workshop and everybody in the public also recognizes. We have this process of deforestation. And that represents very dramatically what is happening to plant life, to the ecosystems from the point of view of the plant life. Here's an amazing projection derived by the Global Forest Watch, indicating what must have been the intact forest 8,000 years ago. And 8,000 years ago is relevant because this is roughly the time when our species, the human population, began to massively expand and spread throughout the planet. The closed intact forests, those forests with a closed canopy 8,000 years ago, must have had this distribution at that time. Knowing the current rates of deforestation, this metric that I've been mentioning, we can project what would be the situation like if we continue with business as usual, with the deforestation rates that we have today going forward. We would end up with intact closed forests with a dramatic situation, as you can see in this slide. I wanted to use this couple of slides to illustrate my point that we can see, by using satellite imagery and remote sensing technology, the incredible impact that we can impose on our planet from the point of view of the ecosystems viewed with the lens of the vegetation. Unfortunately, these very vivid, dramatic, and really compelling images cannot tell us too much about what is happening with animal life. So as we have deforestation to illustrate this problem, we need to come up with a term that brings attention to the fact that we are dramatically also losing wildlife, we're losing fauna. And hence the term defaunation, a term that in our lab we have been using for some time now. And I think that we need to recognize that equivalent to deforestation, we have a problem of defaunation. Defaunation has been examined in very superficial ways many decades ago. Some of you might remember a classical paper by Oliver Phillips, published in the Annual Review of Ecology and Systematics some years ago, in which he looked at the situation of tropical ecosystems of the planet. And he mentions in that paper that the loss of animal is an invisible threat, because we did not have information as to what is happening to these components of biodiversity, the wildlife, the animals. And this set of, this collage of horrendous images that you see here do give you an idea that the situation with animal life is not a happy one. In fact, it's a very dramatic one. Of course, we had not accumulated quantitative information and detailed information about the trends and patterns and trajectories of the situation. But we're improving now, and we can have a very good picture to illustrate, to confirm that this is a very serious problem. By the way, at least these two photographs, these two photos in this collage are situations that I have taken photos of in the Amazon region. So let me very quickly try and describe for you what is the first element of our discussion in this workshop, which is the loss of animal life. Let me start with a macroscopic view and a very rough view by looking at animal biomass through the last 10,000 years. Here you see three bars in this graph. The one on the left indicates the biomass measured in terms of millions of tons 10,000 years ago. W here means wildlife. And red, this little section that you see here on top, probably see here on top, represents human biomass. 10,000 years ago, we had roughly 300 million tons of animal biomass. Most of it was wildlife biomass, the animals of the planet. Fast forward to year 1900, and you can see that we roughly have the same total biomass, but now the composition is very different. The red, which is humanity, Homo sapiens, increases quite significantly, but now a new element comes in, which is the domesticated animals of the planet. The consequence of that, given that we kept the same total biomass, is that W declined dramatically. The biomass of wildlife has declined dramatically by year 1900. If you move on to now, basically, on the right-hand side, the biomass of animals on the planet in year 2015, that is to say today, basically, two things become very apparent to you. The total biomass presents a dramatic increase now to 1850 million tons, but the composition is even more dramatic. A gigantic increase in the biomass of the human population, but even more dramatic increase in the biomass of the domesticated animals of the planet. All of that bringing about a tremendous reduction of the biomass of wildlife, of animals. So we live now in a planet in which we have transformed the organization in terms of this very crude measure, which is animal biomass, into a very dramatic situation where we have a tremendous dominance of domesticated biomass and human biomass. And of course, it is very easy for you in this call to imagine, in this workshop to imagine, what are the implications of this. For us to accommodate, for example, D, the domesticated biomass on the planet, we need to destroy the habitats to accommodate cattle ranching, grasslands for cattle grazing, those kinds of things. And of course, all of that is a phenomenon that contributes to the defaunation that we have today. A typical metric to examine, to pay attention to the fact that we're losing wildlife is the extinction, the global extinction metrics, or the global extinction estimates. And if you look at the IUCN red list of species, of endangered species, you can come up with a number of estimated species that have gone extinct, for example, since year 1500. Here you see a selection of some of my favorite, not favorite in the sense that they have gone extinct, but animals that I would have appreciated to have known, but we have lost, unfortunately, today. And you can choose the one that you would prefer to see in this slide. The point that I want to make is that we tend to think of global species extinction as the metric to estimate this process of defaunation in the Anthropocene. Here I have a slide that shows some numbers published relatively recently by Professor Gerardo Ceballos and other zoologists. What you have here on the left-hand side is the number of species that have been recorded as extinct, unequivocally extinct. This is the case of vertebrates, 338. That number, however, is relatively low, as you can see. But the interesting thing is that if you look at the number of extinctions that have occurred more recently, exactly since the year 1900, a great proportion of that is accounted for by the recent extinction. So almost 200 out of the 338 have taken place in the year 1900. If you look at the species 617, which includes a number which includes extinct, extinct in the wild, and in imminent risk of extinction, that number becomes 617. And of that number, almost 480 have become extinct since the year 1900. That is to say, even though these numbers can seem relatively low, we see a dramatic process of acceleration of the extinction, of the global extinction of the species. And of course, even though the numbers look relatively low compared to the background rates of extinction, in the case of mammals, the numbers that you see here, what we see today is that we have a trajectory which is 10 to 100 times faster than the background extinctions of vertebrates. So we tend to pay attention to the situation of extinction, of global extinction of species as the metric to measure this problem of defaunation. A summary of what I was trying to say in the last slide is shown in this slide, in which you can see this phenomenon of acceleration. But again, the numbers are relatively small. So one has to ask the question, is it the fact that the low numbers of global extinct species the correct way of assessing what is happening to wildlife on the planet? Is it a myopic view of the problem? I want to suggest that that is indeed the case, because there are a number of steps or a sequence of steps that are occurring that eventually lead to this number of global species extinction. But I think that these elements in the sequence are the critical aspects that we need to be paying attention to in our efforts of rewilding, reforesting, and restoring ecosystems. The processes are the local declines in abundance, which in the extreme condition brings about the contraction of the geographic range of the species. That contraction in the range of the distribution of the species has inevitably a consequence, which is the loss or the extinction of local populations, which eventually in the extreme situation leads to the global species extinction. So the numbers of species that are globally extinct can be a deceiving view of what is really happening and what is relevant, I think, in terms of the ecosystem processes and also in terms of what is happening at the local level where humans in local communities live. So I want to elaborate a little bit on this sequence of steps for our discussions later on. Here you have a slide that shows the decline measured as using the Live Planet Index, and it has become very common nowadays to estimate the annual rates of decline. Very simple, this Live Planet Index is nothing but the ratio of the number of individuals of a given population at a given time compared to a previous time. The modeling is not too complicated, but essentially this is the numbers that you need to compile. When we did that in 2014, we estimated for the last 4 decades, from year 1970 to now, a decline of about 50% of the vertebrates over these last 4 decades. I'm sorry, of 25%. If you break down this global decline into regions, and one that we're interested particularly in this workshop is the situation in tropical vertebrates, we can see the actual decline we estimate it to be dramatic, 50% in only 4 decades. The vertebrates of the planet had manifested a decline of 50%. I am amazed to see that the Live Planet Index report on its yearly assessment has come up with a more recent estimate, in this case for the year 2020, and they have come up with an even more dramatic situation. What they have estimated here is not the 50% for the tropics that we calculated in 2014. By 2020, these WWF, which is responsible for the estimations of the global living planet index, they have come up with a much more dramatic rate of decline of 65% in only just a few decades. So these numbers indicate that at a very rapid rate, we had estimated 50% and now 65%, we are declining the numbers of animals around the planet for those species that have been monitored using the metric that I told you. One consequence of that, as you can easily imagine, is that with those declines at a given location, when you look at them collectively, you begin to see the second element that I wanted to discuss with you, which is the contraction of the geographic range of distribution of the species. And here you have three dramatic, emblematic examples: the African elephant, the hippo, and the rhino. In the maps below, you can see in the bluish color what used to be the potential or the overall range distribution of the species, of these three species in the past. And now what you can see in these red polygons in the three maps, the areas in which these species are now restricted to. The implication of this, and of course this is my main point here, is that in those blue areas that do not coincide with the red polygons, we have experienced a dramatic loss of populations. Even though we do not have a good quantification of the number of populations that have gone extinct, these maps actually are clear indications that is happening at a very fast rate and is a dramatic loss. In a region, here I've chosen two examples to illustrate what could be essentially the same situation. On the left-hand side, you see the tapir in Mesoamerica. The light color area here in Mesoamerica represents the distribution of the animal, and the darker red polygons represent the areas where this animal is currently located only. On the right-hand side, you see a similar dramatic situation for the jaguar. You can see a distribution that went from the southern part of the US all the way down to southern South America is now restricted to what this is the current range. So these areas of the pale color here represent for these two species as in the same situation as I presented for the three herbivores of the African savannas, the dramatic loss of populations. My point can be illustrated in more detail, I hope, with this estimate presented for you in this graph. Here you have the sample of a number of mammals. For the period of 1990 to 2015, we have estimated the magnitude of the contraction of the range for this sample of mammalian species. And what you have in this graph is 5 categories of range contraction. The one on the left, the green one, is represents those species that have had a contraction of less than 20%. They have lost only 20% or less of the range. On the other extreme of this graph, you have in number 5, the category in which the species have contracted the range in at least 80%. And on the y-axis, you see the percentage of species that belong to each of these categories of range contraction. And most unfortunately, what you can see is that close to 50%, shy of 50% of the species in this sample have restricted, have reduced, have shrunk the range by at least 80%. Again, emphasizing that the real metric to examine what is happening to our wildlife today is this process of population extinction as represented by the range contraction, which is a result of the local decline of species. So although the numbers of globally extinct species are relatively low, there's the drama, really the real drama of biological extinction in terms of the wildlife, in terms particularly the mammals, is the loss of populations. That's where the problem lies. I think relevant for our discussion in the rest of the workshop today and tomorrow is to ask the question, what kinds of animals are critical for reformation programs? Given the fact that we have seen, as I have tried to illustrate in these previous slides, the drama of the loss of fauna, the defaunation, now we have to come up with a situation. What can we do about it? What can we do in terms of what would be called refaunation? First question about this is what animals are critical for refaunation programs. Situation comes about that the animals present differentiated vulnerability. Not all animals are equal in terms of their vulnerability to being eliminated or to be made decline from the local habitats. Why? That is because there are two combined factors here. We humans have particular preferences for animals that we want to have an impact on in terms of, for example, food, amount of meat, or trade because of the species that have some animal characteristic that we find relevant for trading. The case of the ivory trade would be an example of that. The case of the pelts of jaguars would be another example of that. So we have clear preferences for animals. And we tend to use animals that have these characteristics in mass, in big numbers, or in big size. In addition to that, there is an intrinsic factor that has to do with the natural life history of the animals associated to the home range. And all of those things, the preferences that we have, we tend to prefer species which are diurnal, species which are large in size, species that represent some value for us in terms of food or trade and so on. And those species also have differential susceptibility. All of those characteristics are very conveniently for us reflected in animal body size, such that we prefer animals that have a particular body size, creating the situation that defaunation is not homogeneous, but rather it is differentiated. I am sure that you're guessing exactly what I'm driving at, which is represented in this slide. Starting in the Pleistocene, we began to impact animal species of large body size. You see in this slide a sequence of histograms that represent the frequency distribution of body size on the x-axis in log scale and the frequency of species. And these little black rectangles here represent the median body size of the species at these different moments. So you can see that in the Pleistocene, up in the top of this graph, we eliminated mostly the large animals, and we moved the median value or the body weight of the animals at the time to this value that you can see in the next histogram. We come to the Holocene and then the Anthropocene, as we call it today, and you can see that the median value of body size of the animals is much lower now. If you move forward and you represent the distribution of body size of the species in two categories, the ones that are threatened according to the IUCN in the yellow histogram, and the species which are not threatened, you can see a very significant, statistically and biologically significant difference, which is that the species which are threatened have significantly higher biomass, higher body weight compared to the species which are not threatened. What you see here in these arrows is a trend of downsizing of the species in the median body size. Not that the animals lose size per se individually, but that the species shift the distribution in terms of the body weights to the point in which what we have as non-threatened species are the small animals, such as rodents, and the animals that we still have on the planet today are those that are the animals with larger body size. So a differentiated phenomenon of susceptibility and preference leads to this downsizing effect in the weight of animals. This can be represented in terms of the activities that we do, such as this amazing, impressive study by the Brazilian ecologist, Carlos Perez. Here you have in this slide a very well-known paper in which he related the intensity of hunting going from no hunting to very high intensity for the species that have a biomass of 5 kilos or more in the Brazilian Amazon. And you can see that as you increase human impact on the x-axis, the density in the biomass of the animals declines dramatically. We can say that these are the species that we're losing, these are the losers of the ecosystem today. And it's very logical. As you increase the intensity of impact, these species decline in density and biomass. The important thing and the relevant message of this graph, of this study, is that when you look at the same relationship, but now examining species that have a body size of less than 1 kilogram, then you not only do not have an effect, but you actually see the opposite effect. as you increase intensity of human activities, in this case hunting, you see an increase in the density and the biomass of the animals. But these are the animals that have a biomass of less than 1 kilogram. That is to say, we're breaking now the animal communities in two categories. The species which are the losers, those are the big animals, and the species which are the winners, those are the small animals. And you can easily begin to imagine the consequences of this, given this transformation, this reconfiguration of the wildlife. So in terms of what we need to do in terms of doing refaunation or restoration of the mammalian communities, these are the species that we need to be paying attention to. So this is an example of what is happening when we do activities such as hunting. We prefer and we eliminate selectively the larger animals. If we do other activities such as timber extraction, timber exploitation, and this is an example from Southeast Mexico in the tropical rainforest of the Mayan area in the Yucatan Peninsula. Here you have on the top graph a comparison of areas that have been logged in green, shown in these graphs in green, in these bars in green, versus areas that have been maintained as reserves, unlogged in orange. And you can see that for the areas that have been logged, the small animals, the rodents in this particular case, are significantly more abundant compared to the unlogged areas. If you move on in the lower panel of this graph, for the medium and large animals, you can see exactly the situation the other way around. In areas which have been logged, the medium and large animals are significantly declined in their abundance compared to the areas that have been unlogged. In other words, we're seeing again a situation of winners and losers, whereby the small animals are becoming the winners and the medium and large animals are becoming the losers. In this particular example, the abundance of the medium and large animals has been declined by a factor of 4 times. That is to say, we need to pay attention to the fact that we have this phenomenon of differentiated defaunation, which indicates which are the animals that we should be paying attention to. Not surprisingly, as our workshop today and tomorrow is actually focusing on the ungulates, which are critical in terms of the body mass and also in terms of the functions that they do in the ecosystem. And this is exactly what I want to review now. These drivers of change in the abundance of animals, these drivers of defaunation, which are direct exploitation, land use change, invasive species, and going forward, and even now, climate change, and the combination of all of these is bringing about not only the loss of the populations, but also the loss of the extinction, potential loss or extinction of the services, of the processes that in which these animals are involved. So I think that what you have in mind in terms of the reflections for this workshop today and tomorrow is really critical, not only in terms of the losing of the species, of the bodies that one can count in a given ecosystem, but also in terms of the consequences that that has regarding ecosystem interactions, ecosystem processes. And here you have an illustration of the kinds of things that I'm trying to bring your attention to. This is a review of the literature comparing cases in which we were able to have a situation where animals were in low abundance, in blue in the graphs below, and in natural relatively high abundance. And you can see that there's a plethora of ecological processes in which animals have a very significant role. Litter respiration and decomposition, carrion degradation, water quality and stream respiration, trampling, soil erosion and forage, carbon cycling, and so on and so forth. This, I would say, is an interesting, potentially interesting review, but at the same time, it's a kind of a naive view, because in this study, we just compare a given group of animals for an ecological process. But even so, you can see that this illustrates that animals, particularly ungulates, are relevant in a number of ecological processes. But it's not that the animals operate individually. The animals, the mammalian communities, are embedded or are inserted in a way, in a web, in a network of ecological interactions. So you can see here an illustration by a colleague of mine, Luisa Gines, trying to illustrate this phenomenon. The presence of these animals is not only the correlation of the ecosystem, but you can see that they have links to a number of other organisms, particularly plants in this case. This is the emphasis of this study. And you can see that these animals are not just the decoration. These animals on top of the food chain are affecting these animals, and these animals are affecting a number of interactions with the rest of the plant life in this case. So we come to a situation that if we begin to lose animals, particularly medium and large size animals, we are likely to eliminate all of these linkages that we had in the previous food chain. If we continue losing animals, obviously the disruption of these interactions brings about the extinction of ecological interactions. So the point that I've been trying to illustrate, the loss of populations, is not only the loss of populations per se, but it's also the loss of ecological interactions. If we continue further down in this trajectory, we will end up having a very depauperate food web of interactions, increasingly moving to changes in ecological processes and eventually leading to long-term changes in the structure of the forest with threats to these processes. So the ideas that you guys are going to be discussing these 2 days are very relevant in terms not only of the loss of these animals, but in terms of all of these changes that have to do with interactions and with ecological processes. In other words, restoration, refaunation, rewilding is critical to recompose or to reorganize or to bring back all of these interactions that we're losing in the systems. Let me illustrate one example from my own research to give you a little bit of the flavor as to the consequences, the cascade of consequences that come about when we begin to lose these gills of animals in a forest. I am going to illustrate the case of these 2 groups of animals because they are the focus of our discussion today and tomorrow, but also because they are known to play multiple roles. They are well known to be dispersers. That's the most famous interaction that they are well known for, but they also play the roles of folivores. As you can see, this animal is herbivorizing these plants here, and also they play a role as predators as well. They prey seeds and they attack and they damage seedlings and saplings. Imagine a situation like the ones that you know in your forest in South America, where these animals do all of these activities, and imagine the situation where you have big groups of these peccaries going through the forest understory and evidently creating situations that would be very different when they are not, compared to when they are not present. So let me use one example from my own research to illustrate this situation. My example has to do with this location in Southeast Mexico in the state of Veracruz. Unfortunately, in this area, which is quite relevant because it represents the northernmost point of distribution of the rainforest in the Americas, deforestation and fragmentation have been very dramatic. In this sequence of photographs of satellite images, you see in black the distribution of the forest in 1967, 76, 86, and year 2000. So what you can see here is a dramatic deforestation and fragmentation, which of course is inevitably bound to affect the animal populations living there. We have been monitoring in this situation the occurrence of the animals, including the ungulates present in this place. And to make a long story short, this is an illustration of historical occurrence of these animals at this location. We have unequivocal evidence that these animals were present at some point. Unfortunately, I can confirm for you that all of these animals that have crossed have been locally extinct. And this is critical again. The species are present somewhere in the country or in Latin America, but locally in this place, they are lost. And for me, as an ecologist working in this location, the loss of these animals at this location represents a critical phenomenon to investigate. And let me show you what happens to the tropical understory when you have lost these animals. I'm going to ask the question about herbivory, the consumption of plant tissue and the trampling that these animals do when they are not in the forest. Excuse me, one of the mechanisms that we have been using to examine the situation is a typical analysis that we plant ecologists do. And I wanted to bring this because I think that when we contemplate restoration programs, refaunation programs, we also need to pay attention to the methodologies that we want to use to investigate the consequences on the plants. Here you have a bunch of plants that have been marked individually and also the leaves individually to estimate this thing that you see here, rate consumption, herbivory by vertebrates, by understory mammals. Here's a summary of all data that we published many years ago, and the data has been consistent over the years. On average, in a place that has been well conserved, that maintains the wildlife in the understory in good shape, such as this location, you see overall abundance of this process, herbivory, in about 29–27% of the plants and leaves. In a place that has been completely defauniated of these animals, that have been, in which these animals have been removed by the drivers that we saw just a couple of slides ago, you can see the extinction of this ecological process. So in this location, which is so important for the Mexican ecology, for the Mexican community, you can see that this process of herbivory, mammalian herbivory, is an extinct process. So not only the extinction of species at the local level, but also the local extinction of processes. Unfortunately, this situation is not only that phenomenon of the herbivory. You can imagine that the absence of these animals might have consequences that cascade into a number of phenomena beyond the herbivory per se. So let me illustrate that situation. In the understory of this location, this palm is very abundant. It goes by the name of chocho, by the common name of chocho. And as you can see, naturally, it's a very common plant in the understory. This plant is interesting because one can do very detailed demographic analysis of these species. Given the fact that the stems have these scars, and these scars represent the scars of the leaves that the tree produced, the palm produced, and if you know the rate of leaf production per year, you can actually estimate the age of the palms. So you can estimate the age of the palms by using these scars. You can estimate the fecundity of these palms because you can count the number of fruits produced. You can see the viability and success of those fruits when you look at the germination, and then you look at the establishment of seedlings, baby plants, the juvenile plants, then again the adult plants. So you can do the projection, the demographic projection of this plant when the animals are not present in this location. This is precisely what I want to show you. In the mid-1970s, when we began this study, we calculated the population demography to have a lambda of this species of 1.0. Essentially, the population was stable at that moment in terms of its population growth rate. We experienced the defaunation of this place, and by year 2012, a few decades after, the lambda had increased now by about 3% per year. So this species, in the absence of these animals, is increasing at an incredible rate of 3% per year. And this is relevant because this palm used to be, the fruits of this palm used to be the consumption of tapirs and peccaries and deer and so on. We lose those animals and those seeds now increase the demographic potential of this species. Those seeds that germinate no longer have the herbivores trampling and herbivorizing and doing predation on the seedlings and saplings, and therefore you're bound to explode the population in the absence of these animals. So you can see in this graph a vivid representation of the increase in the lambda. This is Astrocarium, 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 Astrocarium. You can see a dramatic proliferation of this plant species that is potentially very dominant, but it was kept at bay by the animals. In the absence of these animals, you see the increase of this species, and not only that. This has cascaded consequences on the plant community as a whole. For example, here you see that the density of this plant in different plots with different density, you can see that as you increase the density of the plant, in the absence of these animals, the density of stems of the other species declines significantly as well. The species richness, the number of species per plot, also declines in the species that this plant has become very abundant. And the diversity of the species in the understory as a whole also declines dramatically as the abundance of this chocho plant increases, or this Astrocarium plant increases. So losing the animals in this community, in this ecosystem, creates the hyperabundance of these species, which becomes dominant and which becomes the dominant and prevention factor of many of the species in the plant community. So in this location, which is very important, as I said, we are dramatically transforming the plant community as a consequence of the defaunation. So that tells you, I think, quite vividly that the restoration of these ecosystems is critical, not only because of the beautiful decoration that these animals represent here, but also because of the cascade of interactions that are being lost and the consequences that it has for the maintenance of the ecosystem as a whole and maintenance of the biodiversity as a whole. Let me move on to the wrap-up of my presentation today and bring another aspect here. That refaunation, for our plans of refaunation, we really need to pay attention to the habitat, the suitability of the habitat. And for this, we can think of a number of critical elements. For example, the area of the habitat, the conservation status of the habitat. So refaunation into a given location is not only to bring back the animals in given numbers, but also to examine what is the condition of the site where we're going to be introducing, or the condition of the site where we are collecting the animals from. One example to illustrate that situation here. This is again my study site in southern Veracruz in Mexico. And what you have here is this very, excuse me, hypothetical situation of what would happen with the defaunation of this place. What I'm showing here is what is the area required to maintain a viable population of these species listed at the bottom of the slide. And for this, I am using the old genetics model of n equals 50. That is to say, let's assume that we need to have at least 50 animals of these species to maintain a genetically and ecologically and demographically viable population of these species. So on this axis, I'm showing the species, and they are organized in terms of body size, from the smallest, these heteromyid rodents, to the jaguars and tapirs on the right-hand side. And as you can see, for you to maintain the entire community of mammalian fauna here, you will need an area of roughly this size, 60,000 hectares at least, given what we know of this species in this location. If you lose area to this fraction, you're going to be losing all of this section of animals. At least the viable population of these animals will no longer continue to be viable. So the reduction of the area implies a reduction of the species. So for you to be able to maintain, if your target is to maintain the entire community of terrestrial mammals in the understory, the non-volant mammals, you will need to have this area. If you only have this area, you will be basically losing these species and, of course, the ecological processes that these species are involved in. So the example that I used in the previous slide of the transformation of the plant community is because of the answers, is due or related to the absence of animals in this category. So we need to pay attention to the area we want to do the refaunation process in terms of the habitat being suitable for them to maintain viable populations of the species that you want to do the restoration of. In addition to ecological aspects such as the area and the conservation status and so on, we also need to pay attention to the human and the social landscape. And this, as you can see, I try to underscore this very significantly, and the human and social landscape. If we do not have the local communities engaged and involved in this process of restoration, my experience is that usually these do not succeed. So in addition to the ecological and biological elements, we also need to pay attention to the social, ecological, the human and social dimensions of the areas that we want to do a restoration. Let me do the last component of my presentation in terms of reviewing, thanks to this amazing work that a Brazilian student in my lab, Luisa Jenes, which happens to be a student of some of the participants in this workshop today, she put together this amazing review synthesis of the current knowledge of the attempts that we have been made in terms of restoring plant-animal interactions in ecosystems around the globe. What Lisa did, she compared two categories of studies that have been published in the literature. Studies that have been attempted to do some habitat restoration, meaning essentially the restoration of the elements of the ecosystem in terms of the vegetation, typically, and also studies that have attempted to do what she calls trophic rewilding. That is to say, restoration in which you bring animals to restore the ecological trophic relationships. She looked at 4 groups of animals, mammals, birds, insects, and reptiles, and she examined the literature in terms of restoration and rewilding, considering 2 types of ecological interactions: seed dispersal, herbivory, pollination, seed predation, and some indirect effects. Indirect effects reflect at studies in which they try to do, for example, the restoration, and then by restoring vegetation, they indirectly restored the pollinators, which indirectly restored genetic aspects, for example. So those are the indirect effects that she examined in this amazing literature. Some highlights of what she discovered here. The number of studies is predominantly being conducted with mammals, followed by birds and insects and reptiles. But you can see that of the studies that have made an attempt to do some kind of restoration, all of them have to, the vast majority of them have to do with the restoration of the habitat, not directly targeted to the trophic rewilding, to the introduction of animals and restoring the ecological processes. So attempts that have been done to restore processes have been done as a consequence of most of the studies being done with the restoration of the vegetation, very or significantly less in terms of the restoration of the animals, in terms of the rewilding of the trophic interaction. And that low representation in the yellow case here, in the orange case here, is consistent across the different groups of animals, as you can see here. So this clearly shows our need to do more trophic rewilding, more rewilding of systems with trophic restoration in mind. Another interesting thing that she examined was the distribution of these studies, or these efforts around the globe. And as you can see, we're very lucky that a significant amount of studies have been done precisely in the Amazon, and to a very significant extent in Brazil, and also in the Atlantic forest. And is no surprise that some of those studies, or many of those studies, have been done in temperate areas, as you see here in the US or in North America as a whole. But you can see tremendous gaps, for example, in the tropical rainforests of Africa, or dramatically so in Southeast Asia. If you were to superimpose on this map of lizards, you were to superimpose, for example, the map of hotspots of biological diversity, you could see some mismatches there, indicating that although some areas have been, luckily for us, have been studied in terms of restoration and rewilding of ecological processes, we still have tremendous gaps, particularly in some critical areas of the planet. Regarding...
Excuse me, Diesel, you have 5 more minutes.
Yes, I will finish in 5 more minutes, promise, cross my heart. I promise.
Thank
you. Moving on to the types of interactions that that Lisa discovered, she noticed that most of the studies that have been done have to do with seed dispersal. So we're relatively okay in terms of studies on seed dispersal and restoration, particularly because of studies conducted in Brazil to a large extent. Much less in the studies that have to do with herbivory, much less in pollination, and even less in terms of seed predation, which is a very critical ecological process that we clearly have understudied. And in terms of the species that are involved in these interactions, here you can see that birds and mammals have been the main target of studies, particularly in seed dispersal. Moving on to meta-analysis that she conducted, no time to go into the details of this, and in fact, no need to go into the details of this. On the panel A on the left-hand side, you can see that comparing restored sites versus reference sites, there's basically no statistical distinction between efforts comparing restored sites versus reference sites. Reference sites are the sites that have not been impacted at all, so it's no surprise that there is no clear significance there. Comparing, though, restored versus degraded sites, you can see that at least in the processes for which sample sizes were good, you can see that clearly restored sites did better than degraded sites in terms of these ecological processes. So restoration of wildlife with an emphasis on species interactions, on restoring trophic interactions, can actually have positive effects, as you can see here in this review. Okay, so this leads me to try and put together in bullet points some of the factors, some of the aspects that I tried to mention implicitly throughout this long and boring presentation. My apologies. And I want to summarize these 7 bullet points for you. We need to pay attention to the source of animals. Where do the animals are going to be brought back from? And of course, we need to address the situation of population variation. When we are attempting to do refaunation or restoration studies bringing animals back, population variation needs to be paid attention to. We bring animals from a population in which they are very different to the location of the animals that used to be present in the location we want to introduce them. We need to be paying attention. That might be a factor that may determine the success or not of the effort. We need to pay attention in the second bullet point, of course, to quarantine efforts to make sure that we don't bring animals that might represent a risk of disease or spillovers of disease. We need to, as I mentioned, to be very careful about the suitability of the site that we are bringing the animals into, or the site where the animals are being brought from, particularly to be paying attention to the carrying capacity and to maintain viable populations. It would be very interesting, I suppose, to not to engage in massive projects before we do some pilot trials. We do some smaller scale trials to see if things are going to go well before we engage in the massive, extensive attempts to do reforestation. Both in those pilot trials and when we have already established the population that we want to introduce, we obviously want to keep on monitoring of the populations and the interactions and processes as to what extent they've been restored or not. Second to last, but not for that less important, we need to inform and engage the local communities that live in those places where we want to do the restoration processes. Because it is my experience that if we do not involve the local communities in the projects, if they do not embrace and engage in the projects, those tend to fail. And for that, we will need to accompany our reforestation efforts with education campaigns and follow-ups. We need to engage and develop programs of citizen science, and of course, to the extent possible, we need to employ the local people to be participants, full participants in the projects that we want to do the restoration of. And last but not least, I want to emphasize my point that reforestation is not only going to bring the beauty of the ecosystem that we used to have when these animals were present, but in so doing, we're also going to be restoring the ecological processes that functioning of ecosystems and we, humanity, ultimately depend on. And with this, I want to finish, and I want to thank you for your patience and your attention. Thank you so very much, Mariela.